Bună dimineața! Vă mulțumesc că sunteți alături de noi la un nou webinar organizat de CIVINET România. Nu am să insist foarte mult pe partea de introducere pentru că avem astăzi o sesiune foarte intensă. Invitatul nostru nu poate să stea mai mult de o oră și aș vrea să ne concentrăm întrebările și comentariile pe care le aveți după prezentarea pe care o va face, strict pe subiectele despre care va vorbi astăzi. Îi mulțumesc lui Piotr Rapacz, team leader la DG Move, Directoratul General pentru Mobilitate și Transportul din cadrul Comisiei Europene, că se află alături de noi și că a acceptat extrem de rapid, în câteva minute, invitația pe care i-am trimis-o de a fi astăzi vorbitor la webinarul CIVINET România. Pentru cei care nu înțelegeți limba engleză sau aveți nevoie de ajutor, vă rog frumos să acționați butonul Interpretation din bara de jos și alegeți opțiunea română și acolo îl veți auzi pe Cristi traducând ceea ce se discută. Și pentru întrebări, vă rog frumos, utilizați opțiunea de chat. Am să încerc să preiau cât mai multe din întrebările dumneavoastră. Piotr, please, you have the floor. Or you have the screen, sorry, not the floor.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to the webinar. My name is Piotr Rapacz. I work in the European Commission and Director General Move for Mobility and Transport, and I am a coordinator of urban mobility team in the unit B3 of DG Move, and I'm dealing with among other things, the new urban mobility framework that was adopted in December last year. And this will be the content of my presentation, together with other elements of the whole package that was adopted on the same day, so on the 14th of December. And I will share my screen with you so that you can see the presentation, hopefully. Is it visible?
Now, yes, it is visible and it's full screen.
Super. So let me start with a bit of a background, why we are doing anything at all in this field, which is traditionally regarded as a rather local competence, so a subsidiarity principle applies. However, we see, especially in the last years, that there are more and more expectations towards the EU regarding doing something with urban mobility, so improving it, helping cities to improve their local transport. And we have a big majority of Europeans, so over 70%, that live in cities, and they expect more solutions, in particular about better and safer mobility, so reduction of injuries and fatalities, and especially among vulnerable road users in urban areas, such as pedestrians and cyclists. That the congestion is reduced, that different types of emissions are reduced, such as greenhouse gas emissions and air and noise pollutants as well. As you can see, urban areas are responsible for about 1/4 of the transport emissions regarding greenhouse gases of the EU. So it's quite a lot, and transport emissions are still on the rise in the EU as a whole. We, at the same time, cannot forget about people who don't live in cities, and in particular those who live in smaller towns, villages, and those areas that surround bigger cities and metropolises. And they are often dependent on private cars to a much larger extent than people in the cities. Of course, climate urgency is a big factor, and in the recent years we have seen not only more ambitious international agreements in that regard, but also a dedicated EU initiatives, and with the European Green Deal from 2019 being the most important strategy in that regard. And basically now every legislative and other act and initiative which is adopted by the EU needs to be climate compliant, and therefore we need to be more ambitious also when it comes to urban mobility. Quickly, some words about the public and stakeholder consultations that we did last year when we were preparing the urban mobility framework. We had 12 weeks open public consultation with almost 950, almost, yeah, over 900 replies received. And we also had 5 dedicated online workshops during the month of June last year, focusing on different aspects of the policy, and with a high participation from both local, regional, and national authorities, as well as stakeholders, organizations, and also NGOs and citizens organizations. So you can see here a summary of what in particular the consultations brought. So in particular, people that participated in the consultations, they expect that public transport remains the backbone of urban transport, and they expect more safe cycling infrastructure and more opportunities for active mobility in general, which also includes walking. Urban road safety needs to be improved according to the respondents, as well as the connectivity between urban and suburban areas, in particular thanks to active mobility and public transport options. EU should do something about harmonization of rules on urban vehicle access regulations, such as low emission zones, and micromobility schemes such as e-scooters. There has been also big support for using new solutions or more innovative zero-emission solutions for urban freight, such as e-bikes, e-cargo bikes, zero-emission vans, and this is linked with rapid growth of e-commerce. That the EU should work further on urban mobility indicators. That we should link EU funding with so-called sustainable urban mobility plans, SUMPs, and that we should make those SUMPs obligatory for cities, irrespective of the size of the city. So that was pretty strong or ambitious in this regard. That the EU should support greening the fleets. And also doing more on e-mobility and recharging infrastructure. That EU should also encourage all organizations to have their own mobility management plans, and that we should organize more car-free days, and that's in the context of European Mobility Week. So as you can see, there was an overall support towards the Commission being more ambitious in constructing its new policy, and that you can see some elements of the new policy which should be more supported than others, such as active mobility, public transport, for example. So this is also what is aligned with our analysis and the results of the evaluation of the previous policy framework, namely
Hello?
Yes, it was an internet problem somewhere.
Disconnection.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've noticed it already once. Sorry for that. I think it's. I came to the office today, and I encountered some technical issues that I wanted to avoid from working from home. Sorry about
it's
that.
Okay. It was less than 1 minute, so nothing happened. But you should share your screen again.
Okay. So here, this I need to turn off. Okay. Share screen.
Yes. No, not full screen. Now it's full screen.
Okay, so so basically, coming back to where I stopped, the results of the consultations more or less align with our analysis and our thinking, and the results of the evaluation of the 2013 urban mobility package. So what are the main elements of the new framework as proposed in December? You can see here a few building blocks, and we have starting from the top left, a reinforced approach to the urban nodes on the TEN-T network, so Trans-European Transport Network. So basically larger cities on this network. That we also should have a reinforced approach to sustainable urban mobility planning, and also some recommendations on mobility management plans, that we should monitor progress thanks to sustainable urban mobility indicators. Another element, important element, is attractive public transport supported by multimodal approach and digitalization. Another one are healthier and safer mobility. So a renewed focus on walking, cycling, and micromobility. Then we have zero emission urban logistics, digitalization, innovation, and new mobility services, a big block. Then another important element are climate neutral cities, as well as energy efficient urban transport. Then increasing awareness, citizen engagement, and assistance to local authorities. Then governments, so reformed expert group on urban mobility. And last but not least, funding and financing and global outreach. So let me start with the first element, which is something new. We didn't have it in the past. So basically, with this urban, with the package of the 14th December, we have proposed some obligations for the biggest cities in the EU. So for the 10T urban nodes, by few articles in the proposal for a revised 10T regulation, and you can see on the screen what in particular is needed, and also this connectivity between the long distance and the short distance transport has to be improved, and basically without well functioning urban nodes, so cities on the 10T network, the whole network can function in a suboptimal way. So therefore, we have proposed some obligations for these biggest cities using the 10T regulation as a vehicle. So in detail, concretely, we have proposed to increase the number of urban nodes from the current 88 to 424. And in practice, this will cover all EU cities that are over 100,000 inhabitants, and in some cases, if a NUTS2 region there is no such a big city, then a capital of such a region, even if it's lower than 100,000 inhabitants. So, for instance, in Belgium, it would mean that, for example, Namur, which is lower, which is smaller than 100,000 inhabitants, but it is a capital of Wallonia, it will be also covered by this requirement. Those urban nodes, so those bigger cities in the EU, they will need to adopt their own sustainable urban mobility plan by 2025. And they will also need to collect and submit some urban mobility data for the sake of urban mobility indicators. And this data should cover as minimum greenhouse.
Da, se pare că avem din nou probleme tehnice, dar sunt convinsă că în câteva secunde se vor rezolva. Da, am primit prezentarea de la Piotr și am să o trimit tuturor celor care ați participat astăzi la webinar.
So,
it's okay, it happens. We can't hear you right now.
Well, I hope it is visible.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so let me go maybe a bit quicker.
Your last sentence was about collecting the data about some indicators.
Yes. So the data for the indicators on greenhouse gas emissions, congestion, road safety, modal share for all modes, access to mobility services, and air and noise pollution. Plus, there is also some other proposals in the regulation in relation to multimodal passenger hubs, including park and ride facilities, and also something on freight terminals, so both passenger and freight aspects are covered. And this is our proposal, so the Commission proposal on the TEN-T regulation, which is now in the co-decision procedure, so-called co-decision procedure. So basically, the European Parliament and the member states, the Council, they will have to agree on the final text. And the work has started already in the Council with the ambition of the French presidency to finish its deliberations on the text by mid-2022, so by the summer, until the French presidency finishes. So let's see how it's gonna go. For the time being, we have seen rather positive reactions by member states. So I think what we have proposed have high chances to actually be supported in the end. Then let's move to another main element, sustainable urban mobility plans, and now we are talking about the urban mobility framework communication. So on top of some provisions in the TEN-T regulation that will be legal requirements once adopted, we also have some elements on SAMPs in the urban mobility framework communication. And in particular, what we will do is this year we will come up with a Commission recommendation on a national SUMP support program and with an updated SUMP concept. So the SUMP concept dates back to 2013. It was Annex 1 to the Urban Mobility Package of 2013. Now we want to update it, and we need to update it. We have all those developments regarding climate, more ambitious goals and commitments, etc. So we need to reflect this also in the SUMP concept. Without, however, making a revolution, we want to keep the main 8 steps that are needed to construct a SUMP, and we don't want to create any disruption here in the process of adopting the plans by cities. And the second element will be directed to central authorities of member states, so that they can create a support framework to support cities in preparing and implementing the SUMPs, with a national coordinator for SUMPs, and with additional technical, legal and other measures to support cities. We also want to increase cooperation on the climate aspects of SUMPs, so the cooperation with Covenant of Mayors and the concept of sustainable energy and climate plans. And we will also continue with our guidance documents under SUMP that are available on ELTIS, our Urban Mobility Observatory, which I always encourage everybody to visit regularly. Then mobility management plans. This is also, this is a new area as well. SUMP was not new, but there are new approaches, let's say, to SUMP, while mobility management plans, it is something new. So mobility management is everything what organizations, companies, schools, etc. are doing to promote getting to those institutions or companies in a sustainable manner. So basically encouraging commuting and getting to the places by other means than private cars, in short. And we would like to encourage the organizations, especially the bigger ones, companies and organizations, to develop their own mobility management plans. We have already a case study on this on ELTIS, and we are planning to develop also a dedicated SUMP guidance document in that regard. Indicators, we have some elements on the data and indicators in the TEN-T regulation that I already mentioned, but we will also continue with supporting cities and member states, also with some actions, so that they are ready to basically deliver on that once this obligation enters into force, when the TEN-T regulation is adopted. So we will continue, we will do a second phase of our pilot project on sustainable urban mobility indicators, SUMI, which ended in 2020 and which resulted in development of 19 sustainable urban mobility indicators. So we want to improve and streamline those indicators, simplify the methodology of some of the indicators, as we know that in some cases, and this is challenging for cities to prepare it, to get the data for some of those indicators. So we are starting this year, and there will be some limited assistance to cities within this exercise, including for data acquisition. And next year, we want to launch a program support action for member states, so for the central authorities under the Connecting Europe facility, also to help them with, in particular, data for those indicators. Going forward, public transport, here we are on the same page as many of the respondents in our consultations, that it must be in the center of sustainable urban mobility planning and local transport in general. However, concerted efforts are needed to make sure that the trust in public transport is regained, and because many public transport operators, they face difficulties following the COVID pandemics and the loss in number of ridership of clients, people who use public transport. We also need to ensure better integration between public transport and other services, such as active mobility services, shared mobility. And we also need to work on the connections between the urban areas and the areas outside the cities. We will also strengthen or reinforce public transport thanks to some initiatives on digitalization. So mobility as a service, for instance, applications need to be developed and public transport has to be included in those mass applications. There are also some other elements that are necessary to increase the attractiveness of public transport. So, for instance, real-time information on timetables and different multimodal options. And in concrete terms, what we are planning to do for public transport, so to reinforce funding and policy support. So the already mentioned reinforced SUMP concept will make it clear that public transport should be at the heart of the SUMP approach. More funding will be also available, and on top of the traditional sources of funding, such as cohesion funds, Connecting Europe facility, there is also a new big element now, the recovery and resilience plans, and we see that many member states are proposing to spend a substantial amount of this fund for public transport. But we need more, and we need in particular to work together with the relevant authorities, so both national and local administrations, plus the stakeholders, to ensure that public transport indeed remains this backbone, and indeed it actually the trust is regained, and the attractiveness of public transport is increased. And we will work on those aspects in the framework of the reformed expert group on urban mobility. And then coming to the digitalization aspects of public transport, here we will review delegated regulation on multimodal travel information services this year, and to in particular consider mandatory provision of the real-time data. So the data, for instance, on timetables and disruptions, etc., which should also cover public transport. Plus, there are some particular or the dedicated provisions on this also in the TEN-T regulation. Something on supporting passengers' access to information, booking, paying their transport tickets through multimodal digital mobility services. Then another important area, active mobility, so walking and cycling. We have a number of provisions proposed in the TEN-T regulation in relation, for instance, to multimodal passenger hubs, to be better integrated with those active transport modes, the requirements to ensure the continuity and accessibility of pedestrian and cycling paths. And also there is an article with some new priorities for urban nodes, and this should also cover the promotion of efficient and zero-emission transport and mobility, including active mobility. When it comes to other actions, we will make sure that walking and cycling feature prominently in this already mentioned updated SUMP concept, and we will also continue with provision of some guidance documents on LTIs. A related action of relevance for safe walking and cycling as well is safety of vulnerable road users in general, and in particular the safety of micromobility devices such as e-scooters. We have in fact already delivered on this last point. So on the 14th of December, a dedicated topic guide on the safe use of micromobility devices was published and is available on LTIs. And this is about how to safely integrate the e-scooter schemes and similar schemes, not only scooters, but the focus is on e-scooters, because this has been in particular an issue from the safety point of view, into the local SUMP framework. Plus, also this year we will provide guidance on so-called quality infrastructure requirements for vulnerable road users, so namely mostly cyclists and pedestrians, and this is under directive on road infrastructure safety management. Moving forward, zero emission urban logistics. This is another important element or building block of the new framework. Not only, but also because we have seen a very rapid growth in the e-commerce activities. This is obviously linked to the pandemics and how it has reshaped the way we work, but also live and order things online. We need more solutions for zero emission vans, cargo bikes, and other measures. We also need new distribution models. We need to better use the existing infrastructure that could be used for urban logistics, such as urban rail and inland waterways. We also need to work more on sharing urban freight data, collection and sharing of this data. And not surprisingly, the urban nodes articles in the revised MT regulation also capture those elements. So there are some proposals in that regard in the MT regulation. On top of that, we will, by the end of this year, revise the CO2 emission performance standards for heavy-duty vehicles. So this will, in the end, also improve the situation of urban logistics, and when it comes, in particular, emissions of the vehicles used for this. We also, on our side in DG Move, because the CO2 work is mostly managed by my colleagues in DG Klima, what we will do in DG Move, we will ensure that this urban logistics aspect are fully integrated in the SUMP framework. So we want to bring closer the sustainable urban logistic plans, SULPs within SUMP. We will strengthen or reinforce our dialogue and collaboration on the urban freight, and for this we will use the already mentioned reformed expert group on urban mobility, and we will support voluntary data sharing. Digitalization is a broad area, and as you can see, there is a lot of fancy words here and fancy, let's say, concepts. But it is true that most of them actually have an impact already on urban mobility, and will have even a bigger impact in the future. So in this broad digitalization sphere, I would like to stress some actions in particular on the urban vehicle access regulations, UVARs. So for instance, low emission zones are one type of UVARs. There are also other types, such as congestion charging, for instance. And we will build on the ongoing work which is already being undertaken with this in the framework of two dedicated studies that we are doing, so-called UVAR box and UVAR exchange, where the focus is on the data provision and information exchange. So we want to build on the results of those studies, and we want to launch a follow-up study this year to map which solutions would be the most appropriate to tackle those aspects at the EU level. What else under digitalization? This for sure will help new mobility services such as free-floating car and bike sharing, ride-hailing, delivery services, etc. This is clearly linked with what we can see happening in the past years, the rapid growth in different applications, thanks to the widespread mobile phone use, smartphones use in particular. We will also work further on connected and automated driving, CCM, and urban air mobility, and in particular how to better connect it within the SUMP framework. Local transport on demand. Here I'm talking about things like Uber type services and other private hire vehicles on demand. We are publishing maybe even this week dedicated guidance on this, the Commission guidance. So you could see this in the coming few days, maybe 1 to 2 weeks max. Also, there are some provisions in the TEN-T regulation that are intended to promote the greening of the urban fleet. Moving forward, because the time is passing, living laboratories, innovation among cities. Here I'm entering something which I suppose is very familiar to you, because we will and we want to further support the CIVITAS initiative, which has been in place since 2002, and which has resulted and is resulting in a number of very interesting projects that are jointly implemented by cities from different member states. We will also use this initiative, of course, to further support local and regional authorities and have better dialogue with them using the politically advisory committee, so Civitas PAC in particular, where we regularly meet with the PAC members. There is a new element in this, broadly speaking, living laboratories or innovative approach, and this is a climate neutral and smart cities mission. I will get to that in a moment. Here you can see a recapitulation of those various actions I mentioned under digitalization and innovation areas. Civitas, I mentioned, Ubers, I mentioned, data, I mentioned, plus some other elements, as you can see. Then climate neutral and smart cities. We are in fact finalizing the call for interest to participate in this mission by cities, and I think it's today, right? The last day of January, with the aim of having at least 100 cities in the EU by 2030, which will be climate neutral. This means, of course, that also urban mobility in those cities will need to be climate neutral by 2030. So this is pretty ambitious goal, but we can see there is a high interest in participation by cities, not only because participation in the cities mission is linked with some financial support, but also getting the so-called climate neutral city label will hopefully enable those cities accessing the funding from different sources, including the EIB and private sector, and will also position those cities as a front runners in innovation and in decarbonization, which we know is the avenue we all need to take, and the sooner the cities do it, the better. But of course, we know there is a lot of problems and challenges linked with that, and we will not leave cities alone in this endeavor. Another important block is increasing awareness, citizen engagement, and assistance to local authorities. Here, we want to continue with what has been working pretty well and which has been very popular, namely the European Mobility Week awareness raising campaign, which basically every year is breaking the participation record. Last year, we've seen over 3,000 cities from over 50 countries participating. We also will continue with our different awards. So we have Civitas Award, we have European Mobility Week Award, what else? SUMP Award, as well as different urban mobility events. So this year we are planning to have 2022 Urban Mobility Days in September, second part of September. And we know that those events are also very important for sharing of good practices, networking, and sharing knowledge and experience. Technical assistance, this is something which we know also we need to not only continue, but possibly also increase, not only because cities or local and regional authorities, they have to do more, this is true, but also to ensure that so some new requirements, such as the ones relating to SUMPs, are met. So in particular, this technical assistance should be directed towards helping cities to prepare and implement the SUMPs and other urban mobility measures and strategies. And we will also continue providing our various guidance documents that I mentioned a few times already under LTIS and elsewhere, which are also, as we learned, pretty useful for city and other level of authorities, and not only in relation to SUMP. Governance, I already also mentioned this a few times quickly. We want to reform the current governance framework. We need a more inclusive platform, and with a stronger agenda that will support our more ambitious framework. And here we will reform the member state expert group on urban mobility, so-called EGUM, that was established in 2014. Now we want to open the participation in this group also to local, regional authorities, as well as different stakeholders and relevant NGOs. And we also want that this new expert group has clearly set agenda to, in particular, support the work on public transport, shared and active mobility, zero-emission logistics, links between urban areas and rural areas, and the coordination on the SUMP aspects. And these are basically the main building blocks that I already talked about today, and it's not surprising that this new group should support further work in those areas. I think that I'm getting to the end. Funding and financing, this has been always a very important element of the support that we've been providing at the EU level for making urban mobility more sustainable, and of course we will continue doing that. The new element maybe is that we will go towards developing stronger links between SUMPs and the EU funding instruments. So for instance, under Connecting Europe facility, the projects that are submitted under urban mobility and which are part of local SUMPs, they will have a priority. Basically, they will receive additional points in the assessment of those proposals. And I already mentioned that we will continue and possibly also increase the level of funding. And I think this national recovery plans are a great vehicle to spend this money in line with the priorities and the needs of cities and regions following the necessary build back better from the pandemics and ensuing lockdowns. Conclusions in summary. I will not go through it again. I think I have mentioned all those elements already. So stronger actions on SUMP, stronger action to make the transition towards climate neutrality of cities a reality. A lot of initiatives relating to digitalization and innovation, broadly speaking. Some for internal markets, so urban vehicle access regulations and this taxi Uber type services. And last but not least, of course, continuing support for local, regional and national actions, and in particular in the areas of rebuilding attractiveness of public transport. I talked about it a lot. Active and shared mobility, that's a new priority. I mean, not a new priority, but something which has grown in importance in last years, and it is expected to grow in importance also in the future. Better protecting vulnerable road users, support to indicators and data gathering by local authorities, a reformed expert group I mentioned, reaching out beyond the EU. So here I mentioned the Covenant of Mayors, and we want to increase the cooperation with relevant groupings that are beyond the EU, such as Covenant of Mayors, but also International Transport Forum for example, increasing awareness and citizen engagement and support to capacity building. I already mentioned all of those elements, and providing guidance as well. So thank you very much. I hope it was useful, and I'm looking forward to receive questions in case you have them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Piotr, very much. Yes, we have a lot of questions. We are not going to address all of them because we have a little bit more than 10 minutes for answers. I am going to read some of them. First of them, if 30% of the population lives in rural areas, why European Commission mobility framework is only urban? In the last 30 years, European Commission massively supported the European cities to improve the urban mobility. While this is great, it created a huge gap with what is happening in the rural areas. Will Piotr agree that European Commission should make more efforts to put rural mobility higher on its agenda and not as an appendix to urban agenda?
Thank you. So this is something what we have seen coming up in the last years in particular. Of course, it is not practically possible to basically integrate rural mobility in the urban framework, because then we will not have urban mobility policy as such. Plus, we also have a policy for road, for rail, for inland waterways, etc., which has some both rural and urban elements. But there is a dedicated initiative which is not transport related, but which has transport element, and which is called EU long-term plan for the rural areas. It was adopted last year. It includes some elements on transport. So I can say that there is a dedicated strategy for rural areas, which is general and over-compassing different areas, including transport, that we will build on. It includes, for example, the new element, which is a cooperation of local authorities in rural areas for the sake of transport and better connectivity with urban areas. Plus, there are some elements on this also in the new urban mobility framework. I think this will grow in importance in the future, but as I said at the beginning, over 70% of population lives in cities. So this is a very good argument for the continuing focus on urban mobility, without, however, neglecting the rural areas. And I think with those two acts that I mentioned, the long-term vision for development of rural areas, and with the new elements under urban mobility framework, the situation for the connectivity in those areas will improve in the future.
Thank you. What is the added value of the SUMI indicators? Is it local or national or European? Will this approach create competition between cities across Europe? Will this sustainable urban mobility indicators framework create a multi-speed countries approach?
Thank you. What is the added value? First of all, those indicators are needed, I would say, in particular for local authorities and also regional and national, to basically assess whether the measures they are proposing and implementing in the framework of, in particular, sustainable urban mobility plans, whether basically those measures are effective or not. Because we see often in the past that on paper there have been great projects, a lot of money was spent, including a lot of EU money, but then the real impacts or results of those projects were really not visible. And by those impacts, I mean, for instance, a reduction of congestion, reduction of CO2 emissions, or increase of passengers using public transport. So despite spending billions of euros, and I know those projects from my country, from Poland, for instance, those effects in the end were not materialized. And why? Also, not only, of course, but also because there was not a proper way to measure those impacts, and what was measured was only, for instance, the number of kilometers of new tramway or new public transport line built, or a number of kilometers of new cycling route, which is important, of course, but we need to measure also the real results and how those results are connected with the EU level commitments. So, for instance, the European Green Deal and the climate goals. So basically, what was needed and what has been missing and what was already identified back in 2013 was the standardized set of indicators that was developed by the EU, which could be used for in a structured manner by cities all across the EU, without necessarily using different metrics and different indicators. So I would say that in particular, this is needed for local authorities also to make sure that the money that is spent locally is spent in accordance with basically good budgeting rules, and of course in accordance with the priorities at the EU and at national level. So I would say that this is the most important element. We will also reinforce those indicators and aspects in the new SUMP framework, and to kind of increase or make the link more visible between the SUMP and the indicators. I don't think that there is a risk of multi-speed approach here, because the indicators will be mandatory only for the biggest cities, so for the urban nodes on the TEN-T network, and only in relation to the most basic indicators. Now we have developed a set of 19 indicators originally, but what we are proposing to be binding in the TEN-T articles are only 5 or 6 indicators, which are really basic. And to be frank, I'm surprised that the data for these indicators is not yet collected at the EU level. So basically, there is a big gap. We have a data which is sent to us from member states on really different aspects of transport, but there is a big gap when it comes to urban mobility data in that regard, and I think there is a need to close this gap. And of course, we will not do it without supporting cities and member states that I already mentioned.
So, if I understood correctly, those 5-6 urban mobility indicators are going to be obligatory for the cities that are urban nodes in the future after the approval.
Yes, collecting data for those indicators, yes, will be mandatory, of course, unless something is changed during the negotiations between the Council and the Parliament. We never know, but we can see from the first discussions in the Council that even though some member states would maybe prefer to report this data not every year as we proposed, but for instance every second year, there are some member states that are actually already now asking to add new or additional indicators on top of those that we have proposed. So I think the picture might be a bit different towards the end, because we can also expect that the European Parliament will want to increase the ambition here. But I think the proposal that we have put forward is a kind of a middle ground, rational proposal, which is, I would say, not overly challenging, and with the support that I mentioned, should be realistic to be achieved by 2025.
Another question: how will be the new European urban mobility framework applied in Romanian legislation, and when? It will be like an EU directive in order to be mandatory for Romania. Without the full and mandatory legal implementation, the new European urban mobility framework will be like a nice recommendation.
Yes, that's a very important aspect, and exactly because of that, we have changed our approach. So in 2013, our approach was only soft measures. So basically the Commission communication that recommended SUMPs and other initiatives. Now we are going the step further. So the proposals we have made in the regulation for the TEN-T the proposals on the SUMPs, on data, and some priorities for urban nodes, this will be the legal requirements that, once adopted, will be directly applicable. So the TEN-T regulation is an EU regulation which is directly applicable to all member states. So there is no need to transpose it into a legal framework. That's the difference between regulation and the directive. Directives needs to be transposed. The regulations, they apply directly. So once TEN-T regulation is adopted, it will be directly applicable, and basically it will be a law in all member states to in relation to the EU urban nodes, so not all the cities, only the bigger cities, over 100,000 inhabitants in short, they will need to adopt their own SUMPs by 2025, or whatever date is going to be final, and to collect the data for urban mobility indicators, and this will be a legal obligation in all member states, including in Romania. Then the urban mobility framework communication will not be transposed because it is a communication, it is not a binding initiative. However, it creates a framework and which indicates that some elements of this framework will be linked, for instance, with EU funding. So even though they will not be binding as such, but by linking some elements such as SUMP with EU funding, we are going towards making basically some elements obligatory, even though they are not proposed in the binding regulations such as TEN-T regulation. And the important point here, why we are doing it also, in 2020, there was a Court of Auditors report on urban mobility, EU urban mobility policy and funding, and the Court of Auditors explicitly recommended, and they made two recommendations, and they recommended that the Commission should oblige the TEN-T cities to have a SUMP by a certain date and to collect some basic data for urban mobility indicators. So we are basically delivering on the recommendations of the Court of Auditors from 2020. And by the way, we agreed with those recommendations because they make sense. And why on TEN-T and not on the whole EU territory and basically not applicable to all cities? Because the TEN-T regulation gives a legal basis for the EU intervention, and there is this network effect. So the effectiveness of the whole network, which is at stake if cities that are the urban nodes on the network don't function properly. So there is a legal basis there, and I'm optimistic that the solution that we are proposing will be a workable one.
I'm going to send those that participated today in the webinar your proposal for the urban nodes, for the TEN-T urban nodes. The one that is on the Commission website, so they can check the new cities that are proposed from Romania to be part of the new network. I have, I think, 10 more questions, but this is the last one. Is there a change for the sake of traffic safety to add a directive for static automated speed traps for hazardous points? Because this is desperately needed in a mandatory sense. So is there any intention from the European Commission on those static automated speed traps for the points where traffic accidents happen?
When it comes to road safety, this is an area where the Commission's role is limited in urban areas in particular. So we have the Vision Zero, which is a EU strategy and a political commitment by the ministers. We have some directives, like the one that I mentioned on the road infrastructure safety management. However, I don't think it is realistic to expect that there will be a dedicated act on this particular aspect of static automated speed traps for hazardous points, because I mean, the approach that the Commission is taking is the safe system approach, which is basically making sure that the whole system for road transport functions in this way from the design. However, of course, we have subsidiarity and we cannot dictate everything at the level of the directives. So basically, how to ensure it at the end, it's up to member states and cities and regions in some cases. So, for instance, a similar question was asked by the European Parliament whether the Commission will make mandatory 30 km/h zones in cities. And the reply of the Commission is that even though we recommend it, we have the Vision Zero for road safety, we will not mandate it because this aspect should be dealt by on the national basis. And I think the same would go for this question asked. However, I'm not a road safety expert. I can always ask this question to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Piotr. I think the time is up. Thank you for this marathon, for talking so much and so intense and so interesting during the last hour. I hope that you are going to accept our future invitations to our webinars. People were very interested. No one left the meeting from the beginning up to the end. So thank you very much once again. Și acum am să schimb în limba română. Ne vedem în 10 februarie la următorul webinar despre metode de planificare urbană pentru străzi, pentru orașe și câteva cuvinte despre PNRR, componenta de mobilitate urbană. Găsiți toate detaliile pentru înscriere pe social media CIVINET România. So, Piotr, if you want to add the last few words at the ending of the webinar.
And I think just to close, thanks a lot for interesting questions. I wish we had more time, but we can always arrange another meeting in the future. And I suppose my presentation will be shared with the participants, so you can always take a look into that. And in case you have questions that you would need to get an answer, don't hesitate to send me an email. Thanks a lot, and have a nice day.
Have a nice day. Thank you. Vă mulțumesc și dumneavoastră și urmează să ne vedem în 10 februarie, așa cum am promis, la un nou webinar despre modalități de planificare urbană pentru străzi pentru oameni și câteva cuvinte despre PNRR. O să ne uităm mai în atenție la concluziile și rezultatele proiectului MOR, un proiect finanțat din fonduri europene care exact acest lucru a vizat, și anume să creeze noi instrumente de planificare urbană în favoarea cetățenilor și acolo este vorba despre nodurile TENT. Am să vă trimit prezentarea lui Piotr și propunerea Comisiei pentru nodurile TENT, precum și un link la actualul sistem de indicatori de mobilitate urbană pe care Comisia i-a gândit și care anul acesta vor intra într-un proces de revizie, așa cum ne-a spus Piotr. Vă mulțumesc pentru participare și vă doresc o zi frumoasă în continuare.